Hello everybody and welcome. Our plan for next half an hour is to do what will hopefully be quite an interactive session. We've got a few slides, but we really do value your input. And what we're going to be doing is just exploring how we reacted from a leadership and management point of view to the last 15 months. I think there's three things to say before we start. I mean, first of all, and most importantly, we haven't got all of the answers. And actually, that's a theme which will run through the entire presentation. And secondly, we're well aware that I suspect the vast majority of people in this session today were faced with exactly the same issues. And so in some ways, that's great because we weren't alone. But in another way, everybody was operating in silos in different schools, in different universities. And finally, I think the key thing is that, and this is maybe one of the key things from the presentation, is that this was a team effort. It was the entire school, it was the entire university, it was the entire sector in many ways that reacted. So what we're trying to do in this presentation, and the second slide will show you this, is just to try to re-examine our reaction to the pandemic and what we did, and maybe in hindsight why we did it as business schools. And the first slide is really about the idea of leadership. And I think so much of what happened in the last 15 months has been about leadership rather than management. And we quite deliberately used that term. And we've created just a bit of a spectrum here, all the way from the idea of micro leadership, the idea that you're here, there, you're everywhere, and it's almost like a development from micromanagement, but also going to the other side, a more sort of, we called it Prosecco leadership. It's the idea that, you sit back, you kick off your shoes, although I don't know if many people are wearing shoes in the sort of virtual world that we live in here, pour a glass of something and just let people get on with it. So we're going to be looking and examining this spectrum, and I'll hand over to Rob.
Thank you. I didn't realize, Peter, we didn't actually introduce ourselves. Would you like to introduce yourself first, and I'll introduce myself and continue with the slide?
Hello, I'm Peter Wolstencroft, subject leader at Liverpool John Moores University.
Hello everyone, my name is Rob Kivits and I'm an associate head at Coventry University for the faculty within the School of Strategy and Leadership. So we looked back and we did a backward view. We decided to think, like, what happened at the start of the pandemic? And we thought it was really captioned by the phrase, did somebody check the fridge? What happened is that, from one day to the next, we were basically asked not to come into work anymore and stay at home, work from home, which meant that many of us probably had left quite a few personal items in their workplace. And, we were all worried that the milk was starting their own life inside the fridge. That was that rush to head home. Potentially some people, had been working from home for a few days as they would normally do. Then they would have received the message, you can't come back into the university. We would have left our phone chargers, our coats, our bags at work as you normally would expect to go back and pick them up. And then what happened at the same time from our management leadership perspective was that suddenly we were faced with the fact that we couldn't speak to our co-workers anymore. So we quickly had to switch, as everybody at Peter already said, we've all been in this situation, but we switched from management more to leadership. I think it wasn't so much more about telling exactly our staff what needed to be done, but it was about becoming present and doing more leadership than management. We didn't think there was any right or wrong. This was the pandemic hybrid working, where we didn't have corridor conversations anymore. So where were we going to end up? That was the question that kept us busy in that first period.
And I think the key thing that came across was, as Rob said, really, it was that lack of everyday contact. And so what evolved was a 3-stage series of plans for communication, all designed to create what could be termed hypervisibility. So the formal part was still there in terms of school meetings, but as ever with the school meetings, they tended to be one-way communication with only maybe sort of minimal interaction. And what was obviously lacking was those semi-formal and informal communication. And I think that was something that we put a lot of work into to sort of replicate the sort of dropping into somebody's office. So what I think we didn't want to do in hindsight is to just sort of be bothering people constantly and just say, look, you know, you do this, do that, do the other. Pretty much because, frankly, as I'm sure most of us felt at the start of the pandemic, we didn't have the answers. We had no idea what was going on. We were, to a certain extent, making it up on the spot. But what our job was to be there, to communicate, and often in many ways to act as that sort of reassurance for people. So there were various semi-formal approaches that we took, so drop-ins for staff, briefings and others. But in many ways, it was about being there without being there. It was almost like Schrodinger's leadership and management here, that we were there if needed, but wasn't necessarily pushing people constantly.
So why did this happen? It was because, and I'm pretty sure that when we think back, everybody here in the room, we were stressed. There was a lot of uncertainty. We were dealing with the unknown unknowns. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know when we were going to be able to go back. And what we as a leadership team could not do was take that uncertainty away. We couldn't make the unknown unknowns knowns. So what we felt that we needed to do was taking the stress out of the uncertainty. So we were really focusing on that two-way, honest, open channel communication, being able to sit there and let people talk to us, knowing that we didn't know the answer. In a way, it made us feel a little bit like we were becoming more like family, having more personal conversations. What happened, which was not a conscious decision, is that in hindsight, when we look at that conversation that we did as school management with the school staff, somehow left out in that conversation the management above us, which meant that the conversations we were having on the ground, so to say, were perhaps difficult to penetrate from outside. But we felt that this was what we needed to do, because if we didn't have these conversations, if we weren't there taking the stress out of the uncertainty for staff members, we would have all of this panic going around and people sitting at home, being alone, not being able to share that conversation. That didn't feel right to us. And in a way, we were actually acting based on what we believed that we thought we would like to happen to us. So the leadership above us, we were hoping that they were going to do that to us, and we were implementing that to the staff members below us. Sorry, Peter, you take this one.
Yeah, I was, just to build on what Rob said, and I think one of the key things here is something that Mary has put in the chat, that in some ways, for people who are dealing with a very stressful situation, there's almost communication overload. And it's been fascinating looking back at our actions and looking back at what happened and why it happened. And I know there's some cases of being sort of wise after the event, but I think one thing that I would learn from this experience is that sometimes you can have too much communication. And when we get on to later slides, I think one thing that both of us have tried to do is to cut down communication. And actually, as I said before, it is the idea of having to be there but not being there. So you don't want to bother people, but you do want them to feel supported. What's absolutely fascinating is this decision to act almost like a community, almost like a family, was in many cases unconscious. It wasn't something that was a decision, and it came out of simply by necessity. I think from a leadership point of view, your roles change from simply sort of, telling people what to do, filling out PDPRs, appraisal forms and so on, to being somebody who was there who didn't have the answers but could offer reassurance. And actually the word which I think sprang out when we were talking, when we're looking back, is that word, that counselling word. What was fascinating was the fact that so many of our communications were just not about pandemic issues. What they were about was, whether somebody's dog was okay, whether people managed to find sort of eggs at local Sainsbury's. It was that sort of day-to-day conversation, which is absolutely, you would learn nothing about it in the textbooks, but it drew us far closer together as a community. But in answer to the question, one of the key mistakes I think that certainly I made at the start was sending out too many things, trying to over-communicate and over-compensate for the situation.
You're very right, Peter, and we did learn that very quickly, I think, and we'll come to that in one of the later slides. But I think the drop-ins, and I think it's the first point on the slide here, I think what we felt was more important. It was more important that we were having these drop-in sessions than what we were saying in the drop-in sessions. That initial phase where people felt out of touch, they couldn't speak to other people, just to have the ability for them to come in and talk, or even just listen, because quite a few staff members would show up regularly to these drop-in sessions, but not necessarily speak, but they would later on comment, "Oh, I'm really happy I came to that session because I felt supported in this, I could listen to that." So the fact that we had them was more important than the message we were giving in them, because you agree, Peter, we didn't know the message most of the time. We were waiting for the message, and the message would sometimes change day by day. So that was a difficult task, I think, for us. So here are some random thoughts that Peter and I, spitball with each other as we went through this reflection. It's that we believe we were doing pure leadership and no longer management at that point, because we didn't know what task to manage out. So we were just doing leadership, asking people if they are okay and how are you doing at home, and indeed, how is the dog? And the success of that, I think, especially early on, was demonstrated by the large attendance that was achieved. Well above attendance of staff in normal non-pandemic meetings and sessions. But it was very intense for the leadership team. This was too intense in a way. It would definitely be too intense to maintain at that level indefinitely. While I believe there's a strong merit to this style of leadership, where you try to be more in touch with your staff members, you couldn't keep that up indefinitely. So we needed to start thinking about, how do we keep the positives that we have learned out of this process, but are able to make it less intense for a single person?
I think we wanted to move from our spectrum away from the micro leadership far more towards the Prosecco end of the leadership, and actually take that step back. As Rob said, the initial panic gave way to, well, we put maturity. I'm never quite convinced that maturity is the right word, but certainly a sort of a deepening of the approaches. And actually what we're trying to do now is moving things forward and thinking what we have learned and what we've actually kept. What's fascinating is I'm looking at the names of people in this seminar, and it's so lovely to see so many people who we've worked with, who has been through it all and who's been part of it all, who is absolutely key part. And what we're looking for now is to think about how we maintain that community, how we maintain that hyper connectivity, and how we make sure that we have that sort of that linked business school approach without actually creating problems for the leadership team, and without actually sort of adding to our stress levels. As I say, our goal is very much to work towards the Prosecco end in the long term. So, for example, from a John Moore's point of view, we still do vast amounts online, and find that people are far more engaged online, which I think is in the message from business schools throughout the UK. And I think, again, there's been a concerted effort into looking at communication and reducing communication. So we're talking about things such as no email Fridays, and actually trying to keep office hours far more closely linked to maybe sort of a 9 to 5 approach. But what it has done is it's brought people closer together. But from a management and leadership point of view, what was put in place is not sustainable. So it's moving things forward and trying to think how it will look like, what it will look like over the next few years, rather than what it is at the moment.
And so we come to the last slide of the presentation we wanted to put in front of you, and then this probably is going to link to questions that we would hope to get some round table going. But so as we are trying to move more towards the Prosecco end of the spectrum, and we will find time again to sit in the garden and have a cold drink, we do need to move away from the all-embracing, empathetic manager. But we couldn't find a good term for this. And this is something that we would like to put to the group, if somebody might have another idea. We were thinking we're not micromanagers, we're not helicopter managers. We don't want to be that overbearing mother that's always there. But we were thinking about something like omnipresent. It's about being the leadership person that is just around the corner. We don't want to be in the room, looking over your shoulder, telling you what to do and how to do it. But we want to be just around the corner. If you do need us, just call our name 3 times and we'll appear. And to be in that position, we weren't quite there in finding a term for it. Is that micro leadership? It's also more about not telling people what to do, but quite a lot more questions I've asked in the last year is more of, are you okay? Then, are you personally okay? Then, are you doing your job properly? So we are very interested in going to see what's going to happen in the industry within the UK, and we would like to ask the question to the members in the group here. How do you think it's going to happen with your university on your campus? Are all of you planning to go back to a full-time workload on campus? We're going to be 5 days on site again. Are universities planning to do a partial working from home system, where they say, okay, look, you're going to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, we won't expect you to come in perhaps for teaching? And as we continue that hybrid level of working, which I think quite a few universities might be thinking about, how is this going to impact our staff communication practices? We will need to have this hybrid communication practice coming into place, that we cannot go back to the old style. We cannot maintain this hyper intense communication that we did at the start of the pandemic, but where are we going to find the golden balance?
I think what's absolutely fascinating is looking in the chat and looking at the solutions, and that's something. This idea of community is something we've played around with an awful lot, and I love the idea that I think Alison put forward about leaving team chats open. I think Mary also picked up on the idea that you open up student rooms early so people can sort of answer for themselves. And it doesn't mean that, you know, the leadership team, the management team, whoever it might be, are constantly there and constantly need to answer the questions. It creates that far more community approach. And for me, that is one of the big takeaways of the last 15 to 18 months. The idea that what it shouldn't be is just a hierarchical structure where the answers are always there at the top. I think the greater connectivity means that the answers are all around us. And as Rob said, we are there if you call our name 3 times, which you should get at scale.
There's some fantastic practices being mentioned in the chat. Mary Crossan talks about opening student sessions 30 minutes early to allow that social connection and reduce isolation. It's a fantastic idea. It really sounds good. And Samir Modi asks, how do we think, Peter, that the structures of the organizations we work with and the processes within them would allow us this transition to a leadership that listens and works collaboratively? And I think, I'll give you a second to think about it, Peter. I think it very much depends on the organization that we work for and who is in the management or leadership team at the time. I think it depends on personalities, really, and hopefully, you know, different organizations have certain champions that would really like to push this and get that integrated more than others. I think my place of work, we have a new dean who seems keen to listen to certain initiatives. I don't know, Peter, if you can speak for Liverpool from your perspective.
I think there's some senior people from Liverpool John Moores on the in the seminar, so yes, everything is absolutely perfect here. But I think this is a really key issue, and I think for me it is something that we need to include as part of our leadership, and I think it's an uncommon business school that doesn't have a degree of autonomy, and so. What we've actually shown, I would argue, over the last 15 to 18 months, is that we can operate as this sort of entity. We can actually operate as this independent entity. And as long as we continue to succeed, as long as we continue to sort of keep people happy, then in actual fact, I think processes can be bent and can be changed to our will. I mean, you know, Samir's hit the nail on the head here. This is the key thing. We can come up with all of the great ideas, but if the processes and structures are not in place, then they're not going to work. So I think from our perspective, our job is to push people above to make sure that the structures are in place.
Sorry, I'm listening to you, Peter, and I'm trying to read the conversation in the chat to give everybody attention here. And I think continuing on that, Julie Brooks made a very good comment. She says, I think it takes a special kind of leader to listen and work collaboratively, and not all managers are capable of doing that, which is again a very true point. And I think that's why, you know, we do need champions in workplaces that can champion this type of practice. And Leanne Domain then says, is there something here about empowerment? And I like her comment. She says, I find myself saying, I trust your judgment on this quite frequently. And I think that is, if you are in that position, I think it's fantastic, where you are in a leadership position and you trust your you trust your employees, that they know the systems, they know the practice, they know what they work for. You can say, okay, I trust you and I can leave you alone with, which tends to start more again on that spectrum that we were talking about. We're leaning again more to that Prosecco end of the spectrum, which, okay, I trust you, you can do this, unless there are any issues, you don't have to bring it back to me, which is where we kind of want to be, because I think it was reading through the text, Mary, or no, I saw somebody saying it can be very intense for leadership to be always there, to be able to answer questions, and we need to separate ourselves at certain times from that, which is why we do want to move to that more Prosecco end. And as Leanne Domain said, I trust you on this, and I trust your instinct, you can do this. Yeah, Rob, I'll try to keep Morgan.
Can I just come in at this point, actually, Rob? Because I think this is a really key point. And I think this might well be anecdotal, but it is backed up by a lot of conversations that in some ways the pandemic has exacerbated the divide between various groups and various universities. And certainly talking to colleagues, there are some universities that have very much embraced empowerment and embraced the idea that we are professionals and we can be trusted to get on with it, really. Whereas others have maybe tightened things and made things very, very rigid indeed, very bureaucratic. But I think an absolutely key point has been made by Alison here about breaking down barriers between academics and professional services staff. And it's something that I've always tried to champion, really, that actually neither group can operate without the other. And actually, to create, again, that excellence of experience, you need to be working together rather than viewing one as, as a sort of superior being, or one as viewing them as separate things. And actually, again, I think for me, that's something that we're going to use very much going forward. So making sure that for all faculty initiatives, the professional service staff are very much included with it, rather than just told, right, we need this, that, and the other. Rob, I think we've run out of time. But maybe just a final point.
I think one interesting point made by Dr. Powell, which I think is interesting, that kind of goes a little bit against what we were saying here. This person felt that the differences in culture between professional services and the faculty actually had become highlighted over the last year. And I wonder if that's perhaps something that can change or can be different from institution to institution. I have felt I have become closer with the people I've been working with. We're now making jokes about Wimbledon and the Euro Cup, whereas before we would only talk about the specific regulations. So it is interesting to see that very different people have experiences in very different ways.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that just reminds me, Rob, I missed the Netherlands result in the Euros the other day. How did you get on?
So England won, didn't they? Shall we go back to England?
Okay, well, we'll do that. And I think in many ways the final words should be left to Mary and a comment on the chat, which is very much about the key thing from a leadership point of view is making sure that staff feel supported to make decisions for the right reasons without fear of being blamed if it didn't work. Good leaders find the balance, and I think that is it. There is nothing else more to say. I talked earlier about the idea of this sort of Schrödinger's leadership, and for me, that's the key thing. That actually, if you are there constantly, you don't create that empowerment. On the other hand, if you're never there, say name 3 times and you don't appear, that causes problems. It's about being towards the Prosecco end of the spectrum for me, but maybe laying off the whole Prosecco until maybe after 5 o'clock and we finished work. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution. Really enjoyed that, and I've taken an awful lot out of the chat as well, and I think things that we can use going forward.